Okay, so now it's time to talk about responses, which don't exactly fit quite into negative feedback, but they're still part of an organism responding to changes in the external environment to try to get the internal environment within limits. The first one, and these responses we're going to talk about here, are growth responses, which is something that's foreign to an animal like probably you or me, is phototropism in plants. Tropisms in general are growth responses in plants. Animals have nervous systems, so when a stimulus occurs, we are very likely to respond with muscles, moving our bones, bringing about some kind of an appropriate change in the environment that's going to satisfy what our brain wanted to have happen. But plants don't have muscles to move, and instead they have to do something else. So organisms do respond to changes in their external environments, and a couple we need to talk about, which you probably did not talk about in general bio last year, is tropisms. Phototropism means to grow in response to light. Okay, so it turns out if a plant is placed in a windowsill or growing in a sidewalk against a house where the light is always coming from one side, the plant will end up bending towards the light. The reason this happens is the tip of the shoot, that's up here, produces a hormone that we call auxin. Charles Darwin's, one of his sons, I believe, was working on this. Charles himself, actually, I think, helped look into this too. The auxin that's made by the tip here is not evenly transported down the chute. So the light hits the tip here, and auxin is transported down, and that's what you see in blue coming down. That's the auxin levels coming down. If the plant is bent, and the light is coming from one side, this side over here is shaded, this side over here gets sun. The auxin is preferentially transported down the shaded side. Auxin stimulates cells to elongate. Now, we don't think the story is all auxin. It may also involve gibberellins or cytokinins, but auxin stimulates, at least partly, the cells on the shaded side to elongate, and that causes an uneven growth pattern which bends the stem towards the light. That ends up maintaining homeostasis inside the leaves because they're more able to trap sunlight facing the sun than they would if they've been facing away. So with this simple system, plants can easily adapt to changing light profiles caused by the plants growing around them. So if there's a big plant here shading another plant, this plant here can actually bend away from it, grow towards the light, and maximize photosynthesis. So this is called a tropism. Tropisms in general are growth responses. The next two are also kind of growth responses. The first of these two is bacteria growing in solution. Bacteria grow in soil, they grow in water, and they grow in fresh water, and they grow in the marine environment, they grow in the ocean. And they are found in two general patterns of growth. One is the planktonic pattern, which is they're floating in the water. In planktonic patterns, they don't secrete lots of sticky chemicals. They generally, in a planktonic phase of their life, they are not growing a lot, not dividing a lot, although there are exceptions. Instead, they're waiting to stick to a surface. Once they find a surface, they form what is called a biofilm. Biofilms are layers of cells that grow on a surface, and the cells manufacture a substance, and it's called an extracellular matrix. A matrix is a glue-like material secreted by cells to make things stick together. Your bone cells make a matrix of collagen and calcium to stick themselves to one another and create what we know of as bone. So matrix is not just something bacteria make. So it turns out the cells are responding to their environment. What's happened is the bacteria were floating along and they stuck to a surface, and they began to secrete an extracellular matrix which cemented them to the surface. Now, at the surface, they can grow if the stimulus chemicals are there that made them grow. So the reason the bacteria stick to the surface in the first place is there are nutrients probably on the surface that are advantageous for them to be near. So many pond water organisms are like this. Pond water organisms can be planktonic and float freely in the water column, but when they come into contact with a suitable surface, a shift in their behavior occurs. Their genes, their actual genes, change expression patterns, and they begin to manufacture proteins they weren't making while they were planktonic. They basically are creating enzymes that are, and they secrete them to encourage the production of these matrix chemicals, which will stick them on the surface. When you brush your teeth, you are fighting this. This is what the surface of your teeth end up looking like if you haven't brushed them in a while. This is microscopically thin, but the bacteria can hide under this film, and glued to your teeth, the organic acids from fermentation of the bacteria breaking down, food particles in your mouth, eats away at the surface of your teeth. The longer you let this happen, the less time you're going to actually have teeth in your mouth. So it turns out biofilm growth will expand as long as nutrition is available. If the nutrients that were here that caused them to create the biofilm in the first place, if that disappears, the bacteria will actually release from the surface, their gene expression will change, and they will become planktonic, and they will begin floating around again looking for another surface to grow on. So another purpose of the matrix is to protect them from antibiotics and chemicals and drying out and everything else. So biofilms are responsible for the slime growing at the bottoms of ponds, most sinus infections in human nasal cavities, and many internal human infections. The slime actually inhibits the action of antibiotics and makes it more possible for the bacteria to grow. An ear infection is a classic case of this. When you look inside of a middle ear cavity, this is what you're seeing on the bones of the middle ear. This conformation of bacteria with a matrix. That's why middle ear infections are often so difficult to clear up. Your white blood cells have to crawl in there and eat them, and that's difficult to do in an anaerobic environment in the middle ear that's clogged up. So now the next thing, abiotic and biotic interactions affect organisms in a community through symbiosis. So organisms are affected by the other organisms around them symbiotically. Humans have lots of gut bacteria growing in our intestines, and if those bacteria aren't there, we simply don't have a healthy experience in life. You've probably heard of Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome. Those are problems in gut bacteria and inflammation in the wall of the intestines. So the clownfish, classic symbiosis with the anemone, this is a mutualism. If two organisms are intimately interacting and affecting each other's biology in a beneficial way, it's a mutualistic relationship. If two organisms are interacting and one of them we can't figure out if it's hurting or helping, it looks like it's really doing neither, like a barnacle on a whale, it's more commensalistic. Commensalistic means one is helped, but the other organism is not maybe harmed or helped. And in the third case, in one of these interactions, if you have an organism interaction where one organism is definitely being helped, that would be like smallpox virus growing inside of a human being, but the human is harmed, we call that parasitism. Symbiosis is never a trivial thing. Symbiosis is life and death, as you can, if you've ever read about the Black Death or the influenza pandemic, parasitism can be a disaster. So bacterial flora in the human digestive tract, critical for human health. If somebody picks up a Clostridium difficile infection, the only way to really effectively treat it, we found out, is take feces from a healthy person and put it into the diseased patient. The odd thing is, you cannot donate feces for transfer if you've had antibiotics in the last 10 years, because antibiotics kill a lot of your normal flora in your intestines and actually make you less healthy. That's another story for another day. Some a new parasite can actually wipe out host populations. This is what happened to the American chestnut tree. Uh, we lost an entire species across the continent. It was one of America's most renowned trees, most common trees. 50% of the trees in many forests on the east, in the Appalachian region, were chestnuts. They all died in a matter of a decade or two from a blight that was brought over from Europe, probably on a ship into New York Harbor. The fungus Cryphonectria parasitica wiped them out. So it turns out that parasites, when they jump ship and move from one host to a new host, sometimes cause havoc on the new host. Um, it turns out orchids, which are now, I mean, you can buy orchids these days at most nurseries. Many species of orchid cannot grow without a fungus growing on their roots. Turns out, man, most plants are like this. Mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that grow on plant roots, and they increase the ability of the root to absorb nutrients from the soil. In return, the plant feeds the fungus necessary nutrients that it needs. Turns out that if you take an orchid out of its native habitat and the fungus on the roots die, the orchid will then die because it cannot absorb nutrients properly. So symbiosis is not a trivial thing for an organism. It is something that needs to occur. And if something disrupts the symbiosis, the organism's homeostasis and way of life is also affected. And the last thing here about populations being affected by biotic and abiotic factors has to do with nutrients. Nutrient limitation is something that's really important to aquatic systems. I said this in one of the previous lectures. The level of nitrogen and phosphate in seawater and freshwater is really important to the health of the community growing in the water. If there's too many nutrients in the water, what happens is you get algal blooms, and this is a red, it's an algal bloom of dinoflagellates in the ocean, and they produce a toxin. It turns out it kills most vertebrate life and a lot of invertebrate life in the vicinity. So extremely low nitrate and phosphate levels in mountain lakes, rivers, ponds, and streams prevents this kind of stuff from happening and keeps the water clear. But as water gets close to the sea, it gets more nutrients from the land as rainwater runs into it. And so prairie lakes, rivers, ponds, and streams have more algae growth in them, making the water cloudy. Anytime excess nutrients get into aquatic systems, you're going to get excess algae growth. Phosphates and nitrates both encourage that. And the overgrowth of the algae represents a deterioration in the quality of the system. Coral reefs around the world are turning into just algal slime because of our changing reef environments, probably partially due to carbon dioxide acidification and reef overheating caused by the excess CO2 in the air. Anyway, the overgrowth of algae is a disaster for the system because the algae consume all the dissolved oxygen at night and other animals die. Red tide algal blooms are also a disaster because of the nerve toxin, which is also fatal to humans. If you eat a clam that was exposed to this, you'll die because of the nerve toxin. Algal blooms make water undrinkable by humans. Most urban streams and lakes have experienced fish kills in the past due to excess nutrients going in the water and not enough rainwater to dilute everything. So during droughts, creeks often experience blooms, not red tide blooms, but green algal blooms, which results then in a loss of oxygen in the water at night and then death for all the fish. So now that concludes the section on growth patterns, environmental growth patterns, and this is an environmental growth pattern here. We're now going to go to homeostasis.